I remember stepping onto Clearwater Beach that morning feeling like I was already a step behind everyone else, like I had missed a conversation that started long before I arrived. The sand was hot under my feet, the air heavy with salt and sunscreen, and Lauren was already laughing with Ethan like they had their own private world running parallel to mine. At first I told myself I was overthinking things, that I was just tired from work and the long drive from Bayfield, but then I saw him standing too close behind her, his hands moving slowly across her shoulders as he spread sunscreen down her back with a familiarity that made my stomach tighten. I walked over and offered to help, trying to keep my voice light, but Lauren barely glanced at me and said, "Relax, Daniel, you're acting weird," and a few people nearby let out those awkward laughs people use when they don't know where to look. I felt like I was shrinking in real time, like the sun itself was pressing me into the sand. Megan sat next to me later, her voice low as she said she had noticed the tension for months, and hearing that from my 16-year-old daughter hurt more than anything else because it meant I hadn't been imagining the distance growing at home. All the small things I had pushed aside suddenly lined up perfectly in my head, the late medical seminars that never seemed to have photos, the new designer dresses appearing in the closet without explanation, the way Lauren started turning her phone face down whenever I walked into the room, and the unexplained absences that she brushed off as stress. Watching Ethan joke with Tyler like he belonged in our family circle made my chest feel hollow, and I realized that the humiliation wasn't just about that moment on the beach but about months of slowly being pushed to the edges of my own marriage. I didn't raise my voice or start a scene because something inside me had already gone quiet. Instead I opened my phone, scrolled through flights, and booked 3 seats on a late-night departure back to South Carolina. I told Megan and Tyler we were leaving early, framing it as a spontaneous change of plans, and Megan's eyes softened with a kind of understanding that felt too old for her age. The sun started to set, turning the water orange, and I watched Lauren from a distance, still surrounded by friends, still laughing like nothing had shifted, while I felt everything rearranging inside me with a strange calm. That night, while everyone else talked about dinner plans and beach bars, I packed our bags slowly, folding swimsuits that still smelled like the ocean, and realized that the breaking point wasn't loud or dramatic, it was quiet, deliberate, and heavy with the understanding that sometimes the only way to keep your dignity is to walk away without asking anyone to notice. While Lauren was still downstairs by the pool laughing at something Ethan said, I was upstairs in the hotel room moving with a kind of calm precision that surprised even me. I folded Tyler's t-shirts the way he likes them, tight and square, tucked Megan's charger into the side pocket of her backpack, and laid my own clothes flat in the suitcase as if I were preparing for a routine business trip instead of dismantling what was left of our family vacation. The room smelled faintly of coconut sunscreen and the cheap citrus cleaner the hotel used, and every object felt suddenly temporary, like evidence from a life that had already shifted out of place. I kept replaying Lauren's voice in my head telling me to relax and that if I was uncomfortable maybe I should just go home, and the more I thought about it the clearer my decision became, not fueled by anger but by something steadier and colder. I found a blank sheet of hotel stationery and wrote a single sentence in careful, even handwriting, "You told me to go home if I was uncomfortable." So I did. I left the note on the dresser where she couldn't miss it, right beside her designer sunglasses, the ones she claimed were on sale after one of those seminars that never seemed to have photos or colleagues attached to them. There was no dramatic goodbye, no confrontation in the lobby, no raised voices echoing through hallways. I texted her that I was taking the kids back early and that we would talk later, and then I silenced my phone before she could respond. Megan didn't ask questions this time, she just nodded and helped Tyler grab his things, her expression quiet and protective, as if she understood that the worst kind of arguments are the ones that never get spoken out loud. We loaded the car in near silence, the Florida air still heavy and warm even after sunset, and I felt a strange clarity as I pulled out of the parking lot, watching the glowing hotel sign shrink in the rearview mirror. My phone began buzzing before we even reached the highway, Lauren's name lighting up the screen again and again, but I kept my eyes on the road and let the calls go unanswered. The texts came next, rapid and sharp, accusing me of being dramatic, of embarrassing her, of overreacting and ruining the trip for everyone, and each message only reinforced the decision forming solidly in my chest. By the time we crossed into Georgia the sky was completely dark, and the highway stretched out in front of us in long, empty lines illuminated by headlights. The kids eventually fell asleep, Tyler's head tilted against the window, Megan curled up with her hoodie pulled over her face, and I drove through the quiet with nothing but the hum of the engine and my own thoughts. Somewhere near Atlanta, as the city lights flickered in the distance, I realized that shouting would solve nothing and that dramatic confrontations would only blur the truth. What I needed was clarity, documentation, and patience. I would not beg for explanations that insulted my intelligence, and I would not give her the satisfaction of calling me unstable or jealous. If there were lies, I would uncover them carefully. If there were betrayals, they would have consequences grounded in fact, not emotion. The road from Atlanta to Bayfield felt longer than it ever had before, but with every mile I felt less like a humiliated husband and more like a man regaining control over his own life. I did not respond to a single message that night. I did not engage in a single argument. I simply drove, steady and silent, knowing that whatever came next would not be fueled by chaos but by evidence and decisions made without raising my voice. When we got back to Bayfield, I didn't explode or confront anyone, and I didn't pace the house like a man looking for something to break, because by then my mind had shifted into the same mode it uses when a structure fails inspection and I need to find the precise point of weakness. The house felt still without Lauren there, almost sterile, and after the kids went to bed I sat at the kitchen table with our shared tablet, the one we used for bills and streaming movies, and I opened the email app without expecting much, but her account was still logged in, wide open, as careless as everything else had suddenly become. What I found was not a single mistake or a moment of weakness but a pattern stretching back 5 months, over 80 emails between her and Ethan, each one casually intimate, detailed, and confident in the assumption that I would never look closely enough to notice. They didn't just exchange logistics, they narrated their deception, mocking what they called my boring engineer brain, joking about how predictable I was, how easy it was to schedule around my routines, how I would probably be buried in blueprints while they were buried in each other. Reading those words felt less like being stabbed and more like being dissected, because it wasn't only betrayal, it was ridicule. There were explicit references to the beach trip being the perfect cover, a public setting where nothing would look suspicious, where Ethan could be close to her without raising alarms because it was framed as friendship. There were mentions of overnight hospital shifts that never existed, hotel confirmations forwarded back and forth with little comments attached, Savannah 1 month, Charleston the next, and I recognized the dates immediately because I remembered nights when she said she was exhausted from work while I packed Tyler's lunch for school. I opened our credit card statements and began matching dates, line by line, transaction by transaction, and the numbers formed their own narrative. $18,400 over 5 months, spread across boutique clothing stores, spa weekends, private boat rentals, and luxury hotel rooms overlooking waterfronts I had never seen. Each charge corresponded neatly with a message in her inbox, each expense validated by some fabricated conference or emergency shift. Then I pulled the phone records from our account portal and calculated the total duration of calls between her number and Ethan's, 312 late-night calls, adding up to more than 90 hours of conversation that took place while I was asleep upstairs or working late at the office believing my marriage was intact. I built a timeline the way I would build a case study for a failed bridge, documenting inputs, stress points, and the exact sequence of events that led to collapse. I created spreadsheets, labeled folders, saved PDFs of statements, and cross-referenced every date so that nothing relied on emotion or interpretation. The beach humiliation was not an isolated crack in the foundation, it was the visible fracture after months of internal corrosion. As I assembled the evidence, I felt an almost clinical detachment settling in, not because it didn't hurt, but because pain without structure is chaos, and chaos solves nothing. By the time I finished organizing everything into a clear, chronological record, the situation no longer felt like a suspicion or even a discovery, it felt like a completed analysis, precise, unemotional, and impossible to deny. At 7 o'clock Sunday morning, while the neighborhood was still quiet and the air carried that muted stillness before church traffic and lawn mowers, I was standing in my driveway with a box of new locks and a cordless drill, moving with the same deliberate focus I had used the night before while building the timeline. The house was legally titled solely in my name, something we had arranged years earlier when Lauren restructured her student loans, and it made financial sense at the time to keep the property separate, and I remember how grateful she had been back then, how she said it was temporary and practical and nothing more. Now that paperwork felt less like a technicality and more like a boundary I could actually enforce. I removed each deadbolt carefully, setting the old hardware aside in a neat row on the concrete, and replaced them one by one, front door, back door, garage entry, making sure each mechanism aligned perfectly before tightening the final screw. Inside, the kids were still asleep, unaware of the metallic clicks echoing faintly through the house as the locks engaged for the first time. I did not rush and I did not hesitate, because this was not about anger, it was about control and stability, about drawing a clear line after months of deception. When I finished, I carried Lauren's suitcases from the bedroom closet and set them on the porch with the same measured calm, placing them upright against the railing so they would not tip over. I left nothing inside that belonged to her beyond what was legally unavoidable: her clothes, her shoes, the jewelry boxes she kept in the dresser, all of it packed neatly and sealed. She returned Sunday night just after sunset, her car headlights sweeping across the front of the house before cutting off. I watched from inside as she stepped onto the porch, still dressed like she had come straight from dinner, and reached automatically for her key. The metallic scrape as she tried to turn it was brief, followed by a pause, then another attempt with more force, confusion rising visibly in her posture. When she finally looked up and saw me standing just inside the door, her expression shifted from irritation to disbelief. I opened the door but did not step aside. I told her calmly that I knew everything, that I had the emails, the financial records, the phone logs, and that there was no point pretending otherwise. She denied it first, her voice sharp and indignant, saying I was misinterpreting things, that the emails were jokes, that I was spiraling. When that did not move me, she shifted to blaming me, accusing me of being distant, boring, emotionally unavailable, as if that could justify months of calculated deceit. Then the tears came, sudden and theatrical, her shoulders shaking as she said I was destroying our family over misunderstandings. I listened without interrupting, without raising my voice, and when she finally paused I told her that from this point forward communication would happen through attorneys and that she was not allowed inside the house. The words were steady when I said them, even though my chest felt tight, because this was the line I had drawn that morning with steel and screws. I told her the children were staying with me and that any discussions about custody would also be handled legally, not emotionally on a porch in the dark. She looked past me into the hallway as if expecting Megan or Tyler to appear, but they remained upstairs, shielded from the confrontation. I stepped back just long enough to close the door firmly, the new lock sliding into place with a solid, final sound that echoed faintly through the entryway. For the first time in months, the boundary between chaos and order felt physically secured. On Monday evening I met my old college friend Marcus Bennett at the busiest brewery in downtown Bayfield, the kind of place where conversations overlap and travel easily from one wooden table to the next, and I chose it deliberately because privacy was no longer my priority. Marcus had built a reputation as a civil rights attorney who did not tolerate deception lightly, and when I laid out the facts in a steady, measured voice, sliding printed copies of emails and transaction summaries across the table, his reaction was not subtle. He did not shout, but he did lean back in his chair with a sharp exhale and said, loud enough to cut through the background noise, that what I was describing was calculated fraud layered on top of marital betrayal, and that the financial documentation alone told a damning story. A few heads turned, not because we were creating a spectacle, but because certain words carry weight when spoken clearly in a small town. I did not embellish anything and I did not speculate. I simply stated timelines, amounts, dates, and the consistency of deception, and Marcus responded with professional clarity about legal separation, asset protection, and custody positioning. The conversation lasted less than an hour, but it was more than enough. In a community like Bayfield, information does not need to be broadcast when it can be overheard, and by the time we stood up to leave I had already noticed the subtle glances, the recognition, the quiet processing that happens when a narrative begins to shift. By Tuesday morning the shift was tangible. I did not receive dramatic phone calls or confrontational messages, but I noticed the change in tone from mutual acquaintances, the cautious politeness, the slightly longer pauses before speaking. Later that day I went to the hospital where Lauren worked, not to confront her, but to update emergency contact information and clarify insurance details in light of the separation. I kept my explanation simple and factual when I spoke to the administrator, stating that we were separating and that any future correspondence should be directed to me individually rather than jointly. I mentioned in passing that I understood Lauren had been covering numerous overnight shifts recently, and the administrator looked at me with mild confusion before checking her system. She told me, almost casually, that Lauren had not worked a night shift in over 2 months and that her recent schedule had been entirely daytime rotations. The words were delivered without suspicion, without drama, just as a routine clarification, but they widened the scope of the lie instantly. The fabricated overnight hospital shifts that had aligned so neatly with hotel stays in Savannah and Charleston were not scheduling quirks or misunderstood assignments, they were complete inventions. I thanked her for the information, updated the necessary paperwork, and walked out into the parking lot with the realization settling deeper than before. The humiliation at the beach had been public and sharp, but this was different. This was a quiet recalibration of reputation, not fueled by gossip I initiated, but by facts that could no longer be contained. I had not raised my voice, had not accused Lauren publicly, had not sent mass messages or posted anything online. I had simply spoken truth in places where truth tends to circulate. As I drove back through town, passing familiar storefronts and neighbors who now watched a little more closely, I understood that narratives in small communities do not explode, they tilt gradually, and once they begin to lean, gravity does the rest. By midweek the tone of the conversations around me had shifted from cautious curiosity to quiet disclosure, and people who had once avoided eye contact were now approaching me with the hesitant body language of those carrying information they were unsure how to deliver. One neighbor stopped me while I was checking the mailbox and told me, carefully, that she had seen Ethan's car parked in my driveway on multiple weekday afternoons over the past few months, always during hours when she assumed I was at work. She said she had not wanted to interfere in something that might have been innocent, but in light of everything circulating, she felt I should know. Her words were measured, almost apologetic, yet each detail aligned too cleanly with the timeline I had already built. Another conversation came later that evening when a longtime acquaintance mentioned seeing Lauren's best friend, Rachel Turner, at a bookstore cafe in Charleston months earlier, seated across from Ethan in a way that did not resemble a casual meeting. The acquaintance recalled them holding hands briefly across the small wooden table, laughing in a manner that seemed intimate rather than friendly, and the memory had lingered only because Rachel had always been vocal about loyalty and marriage. Hearing that name attached to Ethan did not initially make sense, but it planted a quiet question that I could not ignore. I went back to the financial records with that new variable in mind and began examining hotel bookings more closely, not just the dates but the reservation details. In 2 instances, I noticed overlapping room charges at the same luxury hotels in Savannah and Charleston, separate rooms booked under different names yet paid with the same credit card, Lauren's card. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable, and when I cross-referenced those dates with the emails I had saved, I found messages where Rachel encouraged Lauren to stop overthinking and to pursue what made her happy, framing the affair as empowerment rather than betrayal. Screenshots from group chats, which I accessed through synced backups on the tablet, showed Rachel coaching her on excuses, even suggesting specific conference names and fabricated shift swaps to make the timeline believable. The realization unfolded slowly but completely. Lauren had not only been deceiving me, she had been financing an arrangement far more layered than she likely understood. The dual hotel bookings suggested that Ethan had maintained parallel involvement, leveraging Lauren's resources while sustaining something separate with Rachel. In several messages, Rachel referred to Ethan in language that mirrored Lauren's, possessive and emotionally charged, yet Lauren responded as though she believed herself to be the only one sharing that intimacy. The manipulation was not subtle when viewed from the outside, it was strategic and opportunistic, exploiting Lauren's trust and access to shared finances. As I assembled this additional layer into the existing timeline, the betrayal expanded beyond the marriage itself into something colder and more calculated. Lauren had mocked me with Ethan, had minimized my suspicions, had treated my stability as a weakness, yet in the background she was being maneuvered by the very people she trusted most. The money she believed funded romance had also funded deception against her, and the encouragement she interpreted as friendship had been guidance toward self-sabotage. I did not feel vindicated discovering this. Instead I felt a detached clarity about the architecture of it all, a structure of lies built not just on infidelity but on manipulation, exploitation, and the quiet greed of those who benefited from her willingness to betray. By Thursday morning I was sitting in the office of Caroline Hayes, a divorce attorney whose name carried weight in 3 surrounding counties, and I placed the organized binder of documentation on her desk without dramatics or commentary because the facts spoke more clearly than emotion ever could. She flipped through printed emails, financial summaries, phone logs, and the structured timeline I had built, occasionally nodding as she absorbed the precision of it all, and when she finally looked up she said the grounds were straightforward: adultery supported by documented evidence, financial dissipation of marital assets totaling $18,400, and demonstrable deception that impacted the stability of the household. I told her I was requesting primary physical custody of Megan and Tyler, not as punishment but as preservation of routine and consistency, and that I would not be paying alimony given Lauren's higher salary and documented misconduct. I also made it clear I wanted full reimbursement of every dollar spent facilitating the affair, because accountability without consequence is meaningless. The paperwork moved quickly after that, drafted with clinical language that stripped the situation of emotion and reduced it to legal reality. Caroline arranged for Lauren to be served at the hospital during her shift, not out of cruelty but practicality, ensuring there would be no dramatic confrontation at my home or in front of the children. When the documents were delivered, attached were printed excerpts of her own emails, highlighted sections where she mocked my so-called boring engineer brain and detailed plans for fabricated shifts and hotel stays. I was not there to witness the moment, but by that afternoon I could feel the ripple through town, the way information shifts from rumor to confirmation once stamped with legal weight. The community perception changed almost overnight, no longer built on whispers overheard at a brewery but on formal filings that could not be dismissed as jealousy or misunderstanding. Ethan, who had once moved confidently through social circles, began distancing himself from both Lauren and Rachel, declining invitations and avoiding familiar places. Within days, Rachel moved out of state with little explanation, her social media accounts deactivated as if erasing digital footprints could undo documented transactions. Their retreat was quiet but telling, a contraction after exposure. Lauren called me that evening, her voice unsteady and stripped of the earlier indignation, asking for privacy, asking why I had to make everything public, asking for equal custody as if the previous months had not existed. She said she was humiliated, that her career could suffer, that the children would resent the severity of it all, and beneath her words I heard the first genuine tremor of consequences settling in. I listened without interruption and then told her calmly that the filings were factual, not theatrical, and that equal custody requires equal trust, something she had dismantled deliberately. I said this was not about revenge or public embarrassment but about accountability for actions chosen repeatedly over time. When the call ended, I felt no triumph, only a firm sense of alignment between evidence and outcome. I had not shouted, had not retaliated with cruelty, and had not distorted a single fact. I had demanded accountability in the only language that remains steady when everything else collapses: documentation, law, and the refusal to pretend that betrayal carries no cost. The settlement meeting was scheduled at the same waterfront resort where Lauren and I had held our wedding reception 18 years earlier, a detail I did not overlook and did not object to, because symbolism has a way of clarifying what sentiment tries to blur. I walked through the lobby recognizing the polished floors and the wide glass windows overlooking the water, remembering a younger version of myself standing in that same space believing stability was something you built once and simply maintained. Now I sat at a long conference table with attorneys on both sides, the air heavy not with celebration but with calculation. Lauren looked smaller than I remembered, not physically diminished but compressed by consequence, and when she spoke her voice carried none of the sharpness it once had. She offered partial repayment of the $18,400 and proposed that the records be sealed to protect her professional standing, framing it as a mutual benefit for the children's future. I listened without reacting and then responded with terms that reflected the structure of what had actually occurred: primary physical custody of Megan and Tyler remaining with me, full reimbursement of every dollar spent facilitating the affair, a public filing citing adultery as the grounds for divorce, and a 60-40 division of marital assets in my favor to account for financial dissipation and misconduct. There was no anger in my tone, only clarity, because every request was tied directly to documented evidence already sitting in organized folders on the table. When Caroline presented the additional proof that Lauren's credit card had funded not only her own hotel stays but also separate reservations tied to Rachel's parallel involvement with Ethan, the shift in the room was immediate and undeniable. Lauren's composure fractured in a way I had not seen before, not the controlled tears on the porch or the trembling voice on the phone, but a complete collapse of narrative. She stared at the printed confirmations and screenshots as if seeing them for the first time, the realization settling that she had not only betrayed me but had been manipulated and financially exploited in the process. Her breakdown was not loud, it was quiet and total, shoulders folding inward as the illusion she had defended dissolved under documented fact. There was no dramatic speech and no final accusation exchanged across the table. After a long silence, she picked up the pen and signed every page placed before her, each signature an acknowledgement that the structure she helped destabilize could not be restored through negotiation alone. I signed afterward, steady and composed, and when the meeting concluded I stood, gathered my copies, and walked out past the same waterfront view that once framed our first dance as a married couple. The water looked unchanged, indifferent to the human promises made and broken along its edge. Days later I took Megan and Tyler fishing at the pier near Bayfield, the three of us standing quietly with lines cast into calm water, the rhythm simple and grounding. The sun was lower in the sky when Megan finally asked if I hated their mother, and I felt the weight of that question more than any legal document I had signed. I told them no, that I did not hate her, that I simply understood her now in a way I had not before. I explained that some structures fail not because of a single visible crack but because of hidden stress ignored for too long, and that understanding the failure does not require bitterness, only honesty. As we reeled in our lines and packed up our gear, I felt something steady beneath the loss, the recognition that while one foundation had collapsed under concealed strain, another could be rebuilt with clearer measurements, stronger materials, and no illusions about where the load truly rests.